Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Xavier Salomon. I'm the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator here at the Frick. One of the greatest pleasures about working at the Frick is being part of an extraordinary program which has been ongoing here for almost 20 years, which used to be called the Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Fellowships and is now called the Anne L. Poulet Curatorial Fellowship in honor of our previous director, Anne Poulet. Which is a fellowship that is designed to have students who are finishing their PhDs, usually in the last 2 years of their thesis, and come to the Frick to have their first experience as curators and to learn how to be curators. And we usually allow each fellow to curate his or her own exhibition with accompanying publication. And not only I was one of these fellows many years ago, but it's great to see many of the fellows in this room, past and present, many of whom have moved to great jobs in other institutions in this city, but also all over America and abroad. One of the previous fellows has just been made lecturer at the University of Seoul in South Korea. So it's really a group of people with a far-reaching span in many ways. But as a previous fellow and as the chief curator now, it's great for me to see such young people working in incredible ways on their scholarship and coming up with great ideas of exhibitions, usually based around objects here at the Frick, but not only, and seeing these projects develop over a period of 2 years. Tonight's lecture is by our Poulet Fellow at the moment, who curated the exhibition which just opened last week. And it is very timely because the first review of the show is out in the Wall Street Journal, and it describes the exhibition as a small but dazzling exhibition. And I think dazzling also applies to its curator, Emma Capron, who is going to give the lecture tonight, and who we've been lucky to have here at the Frick for the past 2 years. Emma is a doctoral candidate at the Carthusian Institute of Art in London, where she's working on a dissertation on the patronage of altarpieces in late medieval Avignon, which is due for completion soon, I think, by the end of this year. She graduated in Paris at Sciences Po, and she worked from 2011 to 2016 as a researcher and consultant at Christie's Old Master Paintings department in London, where she worked mostly on northern paintings from the Renaissance to Dutch Golden Age, ranging from early Netherlandish works like the one she will talk about today to great works by Rembrandt. In the summer of 2016, she also worked as a research assistant for the groundbreaking and very important exhibition on Francis I and Netherlandish art at the Louvre, really one of the most important exhibitions in that field in many years anywhere in the world. But Emma has also worked as part of her PhD on very interesting pieces of research, discovering important things like an unknown document proving that Simone Martini painted an altarpiece which no one knew existed before her finding. And this was published in an article, Simone Martini's Last Documented Work, which came out in the Burlington magazine in January of last year, January 2017. We're sorry to see Emma leave after her 2 years fellowship with this incredible project, the Charterhouse of Bruges, the exhibition. But we're happy to know that she will be in very safe hands, moving across the street, not so far away, to take over the post of Slivka Foundation Interdisciplinary Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she will be for the next year, working on the Museum Early French paintings with the curatorial and conservation team there. So we're very happy to see that she will stay in New York and work with friends and colleagues across the street. Now, the exhibition, the Charterhouse of Bruges, is a very in-focused, beautiful exhibition. The review also called it a miracle in many ways, and I think it is both for the quality of the objects in it, but also for the way in which Emma has brought to life the Van Eyck from the Frick, but other objects as well, in a very meaningful way, with very beautiful juxtapositions of great objects, every one of which is very carefully chosen and beautifully juxtaposed with other objects. And she's really transformed a very difficult space in this museum, the cabinet room, into almost a monk's cell, which is very beautiful to see and witness how these objects speak to one another in this context. So without further ado, I would like to invite you all to silence your phones if you have them, and remind you all that this lecture will be streamed live at the moment and also will be available for future viewing online. Also, the exhibition will remain open for about half an hour after the lecture, so if you haven't seen it yet, I invite you all to go and see it afterwards, and it will be on view until the new year. So please join me in welcoming Emma Capron with a lecture, Jan van Eyck, Petrus Christus, and the Charterhouse of Bruges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier, for this very kind and generous introduction. I'd like to start by thanking Ian Wardroper and Xavier Salomon for their complete support and guidance throughout this project, and also heartfelt thanks to all my colleagues at the Frick. It's been a really great privilege to work with all of you. I would like also to acknowledge my co-authors and guides throughout this project too, Marion Ainsworth and Till Holger Borchet, who have provided fantastic essays to the catalog. In his book, A Time to Keep Silence, the great British travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor arrives to the Benedictine Abbey of Fontenelle in Normandy to spend several weeks among the monks. At first awed and unsettled by the forbidding austerity of monastic life, he calls on celebrated old masters to convey his unease. Quote, "The muted light in the church suspended a filament between us, reproducing the exact atmosphere of an early 17th century Spanish studio, in which tonsured, waxen, austere, and exsanguineous were bowed in prayer the models of Zurbarán and El Greco. Not for nothing had these painters so faithfully portrayed the external stigmata of monastic obedience, prayer, meditation, mortification, and mystical experiments, the traces left by the soul's dark night, by the scaling of heavenly mountains, and the exploration of interior mansions." End quote. In contrast to the dramatic chiaroscuro, spiritual anguish, and bleak atmosphere that pervades the Spanish Golden Age paintings summoned by Fermor in this passage, Jan van Eyck and Petrus Christus offer a blissfully serene vision of monastic life in the two panels that form the center of this exhibition. Both works were commissioned in the 1440s by the Carthusian monk Jan Vos, during his time as prior of the Bruges Charterhouse, as monasteries of the Carthusian Order were called. Far from bearing the stigmata of monastic obedience, confident and calm, Vos presents himself to the Virgin and Child. The Carthusian order to which he belonged was, however, one of the most austere of the late Middle Ages, with its monks committed to a life of absolute solitude and silence. In apparent contradiction with this asceticism, their monasteries became remarkable repositories of art, a material accumulation often attributed to lay patronage. While extensive studies exist on what lay people commissioned for charter houses, our knowledge of the patronage of the monks themselves is much more limited. This makes the story of Jan Vos and the two paintings he commissioned from Jan van Eyck and Petrus Christus all the more valuable. Indeed, it offers a rare window into the patronage of a leading Carthusian figure in the 15th century, and into the ways in which the monks used, viewed, and valued images for their daily devotion and liturgy, but also their commemoration and salvation. In addition, the function that the Frick Virgin served for Vos has never been elucidated, nor the reason why the panel was later granted an indulgence. That is, a grant that promised viewers a remission from time served in purgatory in exchange for prayers said in front of the panel. These are some of the themes and questions at the heart of both the exhibition and my lecture tonight. I will begin by exploring Jan Vos's career and patronage. Jan Vos was born in the Dutch city of Delft, but began his career in Utrecht in the central Netherlands, where he's first documented in 1431 as a member of the Teutonic Knights, a military religious order involved in wars against pagans in Eastern Europe and the running of hospitals. Vos probably joined the Carthusian Order around 1432, taking his vow at the Charterhouse of Bruges in Utrecht. 5 years later, Vos had ascended to the position of procurator, which is a sort of financial manager, at the Charterhouse of Bruges. In early April 1441, Vos was called to Bruges in today's Belgium, then the most vibrant commercial center in Northern Europe, in order to become the prior of the local Charterhouse, a monastery known as Reunited. Not much is known of his tenure there, except that in 1444, he secured a tax exemption from Duke Philip the Good, probably an important achievement of his priorate. Jan Vos headed the Bruges Charterhouse until 1450, when he was called back to Utrecht to serve as prior of Nieuwlicht, his original Charterhouse. He spent 8 years there at the helm of this Charterhouse, where his stewardship was later praised as wise and commendable. Due to ill health and age, he was relieved of his charge in 1458 and died at Nieuwlicht 4 years later. According to Carthusian practice, he was buried in the monastery's large cloister. In 1938, the Dutch archival scholar Hendrik Scholtens connected the Frick Virgin to a crucial document. A letter dated September 3rd, 1443, in which the suffragan, or assistant bishop of Utrecht, Martin van Bleya, while on a visit to Genadedal, granted an indulgence of 40 days to 3 images. Archival evidence uncovered while preparing this exhibition shows that this was done at Jan Vos's express request. The original letter is lost, but it was copied in the archive of the Nieuwlicht Charterhouse, specifically in a register called a cartulary, which kept track of a monastery's assets, and this is what you see on screen. A summary of the letter was also written down in the monastery's necrology, the volume that listed the names of people whom the monastery had a duty to commemorate. As will be discussed later, that mentions of the Frick Virgin appeared in these 2 very volumes is significant regarding its function. The 3 images granted an indulgence are listed by order of importance in the letter. The first, described as the largest, was, quote, painted with images of the Most Blessed Mother of God, of Saints Barbara and Elizabeth, unquote. Scholtens convincingly identified this panel to the Frick Virgin and the painting's Carthusian donor to Jan Vos. The letter did not mention who painted the panel, but on stylistic basis, scholars have long associated it to the painter Jan van Eyck, widely considered one of the founding fathers of early Netherlandish painting and celebrated for his visual sophistication and astonishing abilities at rendering minute details, light, and textures. These qualities are manifest in the Frick Virgin. At the center of the panel is the Virgin and Child holding the Christ child in her arms. She's dressed in a crimson robe lined with ermine fur and clad in a blue mantle hemmed with pearls and precious gems. A sign of her distinction, she stands on a rich carpet in front of a cloth of honor and beneath a canopy, which is brocaded with stylized lilies, a flower's which white color alludes to the Virgin's purity. Each lily stem is entwined with a golden scroll inscribed with the abbreviated words Ave Maria, gratia plena, that is, Hail Mary, full of grace, the first line of the Ave Maria. The lively child turns away from his mother to bless Jan Vos, kneeling to the left. Vos is dressed in the distinctive white habit of the Carthusian Order, with the scapular mantle tied by loose straps at the sides. He's introduced by Saint Barbara, identified by her attribute behind her, the three-windowed tower where her father imprisoned her to prevent, unsuccessfully, her conversion to Christianity. Unusually, an idol of the Roman god Mars is depicted inside the tower. This might be an allusion to the idols which Barbara defaced following her miraculous baptism. To the panel's right is Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, holding her attribute, the three crowns, that stand for the sanctity with which she led the three stages of her life, as a virgin, a married woman, and as a widow. The space these figures inhabit exudes material richness, from the white and blue Valencian floor tiles to the slab of red and green porphyry set into the parapet and the carved Romanesque capitals. The portico opens onto a panoramic landscape. To the left, rolling hills inhabited by shepherds and their flocks give way to a mountain range. To the right, bordering a river, is a meticulously rendered walled city, an imaginary place rather than the portrait of an actual town. Peering at the scene from the bushes behind Jan Vos is an enigmatic figure wearing a red turban. The discovery of the Indulgence Letter allowed to establish a timeline for the painting's creation. Jan Vos probably commissioned it upon his arrival in Bruges in April 1441, and it was completed by the time the indulgence was granted in 1443. In this scenario, Van Eyck would have had just 3 short months to work on the painting before his death in June of that year. Technical examination confirms that the artist laid out the essential composition, but that the painting's execution was left to a talented, if anonymous, member of his studio, who relied on stock motifs to complete the composition. This assistant borrowed, among others, from Van Eyck's celebrated Roland Virgin, especially in the column capitals and the landscape background. This makes the panel an important element in our understanding of the activity of the Van Eyck workshop after the master's death. The identification of Jan Vos as the patron also allows to account for the saints depicted, for they were both highly revered by the Teutonic Knights. Saint Barbara was the patron saint of artillerymen, a military slant echoed by the idol of Mars in her tower, while the relics of both Saint Barbara and Saint Elizabeth were kept by the Teutonics at their seat of Marienburg in Poland. Both saints, however, were also highly venerated by the Carthusians, especially Barbara, whose imprisonment in the tower would have deeply resonated with the monks' extreme confinement in their charterhouses. The second image described in the Indulgence Letter is a painted diptych that depicted the resurrection on the right panel and the Virgin nursing the Christ child on the left panel. This diptych is now lost, but we know that Carthusians from the Low Countries, especially high-ranking monks such as priors, were very keen on the diptych format, and 4 examples featuring Carthusian donors survive from this period. In contrast with them, the diptych listed in the Indulgence did not seem to feature a donor portrait, but instead juxtaposed 2 holy scenes, a solution that also occurs in a diptych of the Trinity and the Virgin and Child by Robert Campin. Bookending the story of Christian salvation from Christ's incarnation through the Virgin to his victory at the resurrection, this iconographic pairing would have offered a particularly effective focus for meditation. Interestingly, a small panel by Roger van der Weyden, an artist with documented Carthusian connections, depicts the nursing Virgin. On its reverse, this work once showed St. George and the Dragon, a military saint who was a special protector of the Teutonic Order. It is believed that a lost panel may have completed this ensemble to form a diptych. Although it is impossible to say whether van der Weyden's panel may have been Vos's diptych, they provide a sense of what this lost object might have looked like. The third image described in the Indulgence Letter was a tablet made of clay, depicting the Virgin and Child, which is also untraced today. Not coincidentally, such clay reliefs were a typical production of Utrecht, where Jan Vos had spent his earlier career. They were made of a local material called pipe clay, which turned white upon heating. Though often described as cheap and serially made, some pipe clay reliefs show remarkable ambition and quality. For instance, this exceptional tablet from the Catharine convent in Utrecht, included in the exhibition. Its imagery, with the standing Virgin clad in heavy drapery and holding Christ child in her arm in front of a brocaded cloth of honor, strongly resembles the central group of the Frick Virgin. And it was frequent for pipe clay reliefs to owe a formal debt to Eyck designs. Displaying around its frame Marian hymns in both Latin and Dutch, the relief would have been an apt devotional aid. It's no coincidence to find a clay tablet at the Bruges Charterhouse. They were particularly popular among monastic communities, especially Carthusians. In fact, the only pipe clay sculptor whose name has come down to us is that of Jodocus Vredis, who was himself a Carthusian monk from Westphalia. The Indulgence Letter doesn't make it explicit whether the three images mentioned belonged to Jan Vos, but circumstantial evidence strongly suggests that they did. Jan Vos's effort to procure the indulgence himself indicates that he had stakes in these images. The Frick Virgin incorporates his likeness and was almost certainly commissioned by him during his years in Bruges. Likewise, it's very likely that he acquired the clay tablet during his time in Utrecht and brought it with him to Bruges. It can thus be safely assumed that the small diptych belonged to Jan Vos as well. Jan Vos is associated to a fourth object that is not listed in the Indulgence Letter. Petrus Christus's Virgin and Child with Saint Barbara and Jan Vos, a painting known as the Exeter Virgin because it was first recorded in the collection of the Marquess of Exeter in the 19th century. It now belongs to Berlin's Gemäldegallery, and it is only the second time in its history that the panel leaves the walls of this museum, something for which we are truly grateful. The Exeter Virgin has been connected with the Frick panel on the basis of their close resemblance. And you can rest assured this is the same donor, for they both show the same distinctive mole between their eyebrows. On a stylistic basis, the painting has been unanimously attributed to Petrus Christus, the preeminent artist in Bruges following Van Eyck's death. The panel is dated to about 1450, that is in the early years of the artist's activity in the city. Exactly how Petrus Christus came into contact with Jan Vos is unknown, but as we shall see, the artist had ties to the Bruges Carthusians. As much as it follows the Frick Virgin, the Exeter panel shows an important debt to another late work by Van Eyck, the Lost Virgin and Child with Nicholas van Malbeke, a composition which Christus probably recorded in a drawing generously lent to the exhibition by the Albertina in Vienna. For all the similarities, however, the Exeter Virgin is by no means a copy of either the Frick or the Malbeke Virgin. Dramatically different in scale, the two works fulfill distinct functions and, as we shall see, carried different spiritual values. Being able to associate as many as 4 works of art with a single figure is relatively rare for the late Middle Ages and seemingly unique for a Carthusian. In addition, what the Frick and Exeter Virgins show is not only Jan Vos's engagement with the visual arts, but also his extraordinary discrimination, since he successfully employed the 2 leading painters active in Bruges over the course of his tenure at Genadendal. Marian imagery pervades the images commissioned by Jan Vos, reflecting the Virgin's role as patron of the Carthusian Order. In order to understand how Vos and his fellow monks may have experienced these images, we may now turn to the specificities of their monastic life. The Carthusian Order was founded in the late 11th century by Bruno of Cologne, a cleric who sought to escape the secular world and its corruptions by establishing a monastery in the secluded mountain range of the Grande Chartreuse in the French Alps, from which the order took its name. The Carthusians' central belief was that solitude and silence were the necessary conditions to spiritual elevation and the way to salvation. Carthusian life was structured around this core principle. Its monks avoided contacts with the laity, especially women, and kept interactions to a minimum even amongst themselves. They only met twice a day to recite the divine office, as opposed to 8 times in most other orders. They rarely celebrated Mass and had a simplified liturgy. They gathered for communal meals in the refectory only on Sundays and feast days, otherwise eating alone in their cells. Their diet was strict. They had to remain silent at all times unless otherwise instructed. Most of their lives were thus spent in solitary prayers within the confines of their cells. As a former Carthusian monk interviewed by The New Yorker in 2007 puts it, the battle is defeating the noise inside you. On screen, you can see 2 marble statuettes in the exhibition, which are among the earliest depictions of Carthusians as kneeling devotees. Anticipating the figure of Jan Vos in the Frick Virgin, they embody a paradigm of Carthusian devotion and perpetual prayer. The Carthusians' reputation for purity attracted the attention of the laity, who wished to garner spiritual benefits from association with the order. By the 15th century, popes, royalty, aristocrats from all over Europe lavished their patronage on charterhouses, often securing burial rights within their churches and challenging the order's rejection of worldliness. New foundations increasingly relinquished the desert for locations in the vicinities of cities. The Charterhouse of Bruges is a prime example of that phenomenon. The monastery was founded in 1318, just outside the city, by a group of local patricians. Destroyed in 1578 during the Wars of Religion, an idea of its original appearance is available through Marcus Gerhardt's famous map of Bruges. The most consistent source of patronage for Genadendal throughout the 15th century came from gifts and bequests made by members of Bruges' most prominent families, some of whom even entered monastic life there. This is the case of the Adonis family, a merchant dynasty from Genoa established in Bruges since the 13th century and who over 4 generations developed particularly strong ties to Genadendal. Peter Adonis, one of the family's leading members in the 15th century, and the co-founder of the Jerusalem Chapel in Bruges, joined the monastery as a lay brother in 1454. He remained there until his death a decade later, leaving the monastery a generous bequest. Several other members of the Adonis family would later join the Bruges Carthusians. This connection to the Adonis family is important when exploring the ties that link the Bruges Carthusians to artists such as Jan van Eyck and Petrus Christus, because the family patronized both artists. Either Peter Adonis or his brother Jacob commissioned 2 panels of St. Francis from Jan van Eyck, which scholars have generally identified with works now in Turin and Philadelphia. Peter Adonis also had ties to Petrus Christus. The artist probably painted his portrait, now lost but known through 17th century engraving. Furthermore, Peter's son Anselm and Petrus Christus were members of the same confraternity of Our Lady of the Dry Tree. These links offer a glimpse into the dense network that tied Bruges artists, the city's merchant elite, and Genadendal's monks. Contacts between the Carthusian patrons and Jan van Eyck might be worth considering further while looking at 2 other Eyckian panels also associated with the order. The Washington Annunciation, which may be identified with a panel that decorated the former ducal chapel at the Charterhouse of Bruges near Dijon, and the Detroit St. Jerome, which probably depicts Cardinal Nicola Albergati, prior general of the Carthusian Order, in the guise of the saint. It's been proposed in both cases that these works were gifts from Van Eyck's ducal employer, Philip the Good, to Chaumol and Albergati, respectively. However, the relationship that the Genadendal monks entertained with Jan van Eyck and his workshop opened possibilities for these works to have been commissioned from within the Carthusian Order. Petrus Christus's portrait of a Carthusian lay brother, which has been generously lent to us from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is another painting that links the artist to the Carthusian milieu. It depicts a lay brother, that is, someone who had taken a vow but practiced a relaxed version of Carthusian life. As shown in the portrait, lay brothers wore a simple white hooded robe, were not tonsured, and grew their beard. The panel is signed and dated 1446, which coincides with the middle of Jan Vos's tenure as prior of Reunited. This suggests that the lay brother depicted probably came from that monastery rather than another Charterhouse. The panel is exceptional not only for its outstanding quality, but also because it appears to be the earliest surviving portrait of a cleric in which the sitter is not depicted in the act of praying. The outward gaze and self-confident expression of the young man lacks the modesty traditionally associated with devotional portraiture. This suggests that the portrait was originally intended for a secular rather than a religious context. Considering the prestige associated with the Carthusian order, the commission may have come from the sitter's family, in order perhaps to celebrate or even boast about the young man's entry into the order, in addition to making present in the household the absent sitter, now committed to a life of seclusion. On account of their austerity, Carthusians had an ambivalent attitude towards ornament and images. While some images were shunned as distracting luxuries in the order's rule, others were valued as important tools for meditation. In practice, Carthusians were hardly iconophobes. Throughout Northern Europe, Charterhouses did not lack in visual riches, and in spite of tensions, the Carthusian church interior seems to have differed little from that of other less austere orders. And this is but a miscellaneous selection of the splendid works of art that crowded their monasteries. In the Netherlands alone, Roger van der Weyden, whose son was a Carthusian monk, famously donated the monumental Escorial crucifixion to the newly founded Charterhouse of Schoot near Brussels. Carthusians did not accept these works solely as a concession to lay patrons. As the case of Jan Vos shows, monks actively commissioned and used images themselves, especially in their most intimate space, the cell, where they spent the majority of their time praying, reading, eating, and sleeping. First, Carthusians would have encountered images in the books they read daily or were tasked to copy. In the exhibition is one of the only illustrated manuscripts that survives from Reunided's former library, a small songbook used during Mass, made by one of the Charterhouse's monks for one of his colleagues. On the folio shown on screen, the figures of the Virgin and Child in the painted S initial are worn from generations of monks touching and kissing the image while using the book, a poignant testament to the monks' physical engagements with their objects. Exemplifying the range of devotional tools used by Carthusian is an exceptional prayer bead, also in the exhibition, depicting on one hemisphere the head of the order, François Dupuis, introduced by the order's founder, Saint Bruno, to the Virgin and Child on the other side. This imagery remarkably replicates that of the Frick and Exeter Virgin on a miniature scale. On the bead's outer shell is a scene from the order's foundation myth. Therefore, the whole story of the order, from its miraculous foundation to the present day under Dupuis' stewardship, is encapsulated by this small object. The Exeter Virgin, too, was certainly intended as an object for Vos to use in his cell or on his travel. Small and portable, it could easily be picked up, handled, and examined at close range. Looking at his likeness in the presence of holy figures would have helped Vos visualize this divine encounter in his mind's eye during prayer. This conforms to meditative manuals of the time, which encouraged the use of physical images in order to prompt mental ones. Kneeling on holy ground, far from the industrious city below, Vos exemplified the Carthusian idea of removal from the world. Intimate images such as the Exeter Virgin were certainly all the more crucial for the Carthusians who spent the majority of their time confined to their cells. Images, especially ones so rich in details, would have offered endless possibilities for exploration and mental journeys, helping relieve the strain of complete isolation. I take this opportunity to point out that the Frick counts in its permanent collection a remarkable Sienese panel similarly designed for use in the cell, the moving Christ carrying the cross, a work in this case associated with the Dominican order as indicated by the habit worn by the kneeling friar to the left. While there is no debate regarding the function of the Exeter Virgin, the Frick panel has been variously identified as either an altarpiece or a private devotional image. I argue that it was neither of these. A critical reading of the primary sources is key here to determining the panel's original function. Why was the Indulgence Letter recorded in the cartulary and necrology of the Charterhouse of Bruges specifically? And what does the nature of these documents tell us about the painting? Cartularies recorded a monastery's materials assets, lands, buildings, etc. For instance, here we have a list of the property owned by the Charterhouse of Bruges in the village of Brooklyn, the ancestor of our modern Brooklyn. Unfortunately for the monks, the real estate there was not as coveted as it is today in the New York borough, so we don't know how much that amounted to, but sometimes in the case, and this is the case in Utrecht, cartularies also kept track of immaterial assets, spiritual privileges that lent sanctity to the Charterhouse. Mention of the indulgence in the cartulary, therefore, means that the Frick Virgin, the diptych, and the clay tablet were deemed to have spiritual currency. But that doesn't tell us much about the function of these objects. By contrast, the fact that the content of the Indulgence Letter is summarized in the necrology proves much more informative. Necrologies compile the various aspects of memorial culture at a monastery, the list of the deceased and their gifts to commemorate, the grave registries, etc. The mention of the indulgence in Eulich's necrology suggests that it has something to do with Jan Vos's commemoration. The summary of the letter that appears in the necrology makes this explicit by revealing that the objects were blessed in the pious memory of Jan Vos. Tellingly, the summary overlooks entirely the clay tablet and diptych to focus on the Frick Virgin alone. This provides compelling evidence that the painting, as opposed to the two other objects, performed a commemorative function. More specifically, it is safe to propose that it functioned as Jan Vos's memorial. Wall-mounted memorials or epitaphs were a distinct form of funerary monuments that emerged in the 14th century to attract prayers on the part of the living for the souls of the dead. This was no trivial matter. Indeed, such prayers were then believed to be one of the most effective ways to hasten the deceased release from purgatory into heaven, therefore ensuring their salvation. Broadly defined, memorials consisted in relatively large tablets presenting the effigy of a deceased donor, introduced by saints to holy figures whose intercession they sought, in most cases the Virgin and Child. Generally, memorials would be positioned against a wall in the nave of churches or in alleys of cloisters above the tombs of the deceased, thus functioning as grave markers. A defining features of these tablets were the inscriptions they bore, and that typically included the donor's name, the date of their death, biographical details, and petitions for the viewers to pray for their soul, and that's what you can see here. Befitting their commemorative function, memorials were made of lasting materials, in most cases, sculpted stone, and for more lavish monuments, brass. There is also ample evidence for the existence of painted memorials, though fewer of these have survived due to their relative fragility. Importantly, Jan van Eyck was no stranger to the genre of commemorative painting. Douglas Brine has recently demonstrated that the Van der Peele Virgin was a well-mounted memorial, originally positioned above Van der Peele's grave at the Church of Saint Donation in Bruges. Van Eyck's Rollin Virgin, from which the Frick Virgin borrows substantially, also probably served as an epitaph after the death of Jean Rollin. Finally, one of Van Eyck's most celebrated work, the aforementioned Malbecker Virgin, which was lost during the French Revolution but known through copies, is securely documented as a memorial. An inscription on the frame indicated that the panel was installed in April 1441 in the choir of the Church of St. Martin in Ypres. This date, April 1441, coincides with the arrival of Jan Vos in Bruges. Did Vos see the Malbec Virgin before it was sent to Ypres? We cannot know, but during those weeks, Bruges may have been resonant with Van Eyck's new work. This feat of commemorative painting, combined with the Van der Peele Virgin, then publicly visible as Saint Donation, may have prompted Vos to commission his own memorial from the city's leading artists. The Frick Virgin can thus be located at the tail end of a rich line of Eyckian memorial painting. Its composition and intercessional imagery match the general appearance of Van Eyck's earlier memorial, while it also follows the visual convention of sculpted epitaphs from the period. Extraordinarily, the Frick Virgin appears to be the only surviving memorial tablet associated with a Carthusian figure. While charterhouses are full of lavish tombs designed for lay people, the monks' burial practices were modest, and no monuments were usually erected in their memory. Only faint traces remain of how the Carthusians remembered their own. For instance, upon Peter Adornis's death, one of his fellow monks appended a discreet commemorative inscription to a book that Adornis had bequeathed to the monastery, adding a clumsy yet touching likeness of his late companion in red ink as a visual incentive for readers to remember him in their prayers. This inconspicuous monument to Adornis offers a striking contrast to the visual splendor of Jan Vos's memorial. If Carthusians did not frequently commission wall-mounted memorials, then who did? And where did Jan Vos become accustomed to this form of commemoration? Memorial tablets found particular favor among the secular clergy, the mercantile class, and the nobility. Saint-Omer and Tournai were important centers for the production, but significantly, it is in Utrecht that they are documented in the largest quantity. Remarkably, a register of the graves at Nieuwlicht showed that the Charterhouse itself boasted at least 23 sculpted and painted memorials that hung above the tombs of their possessors in the hallways of their cloisters. Without exception, they all belonged to lay people. It isn't clear what prompted Jan Vos to depart from traditional Carthusian practice and adopt a form of commemoration so closely associated with the laity. His status as a prior may have allowed it. It's possible that the number and perceived efficaciousness of the memorials on display in Utrecht, where he spent about a decade before departing to Bruges, made an impact on him. By the time he arrived in Bruges, Vos was at an age where one usually started planning for death, and Jan van Eyck had completed his important memorials for canons Joris van der Peele and Nicolas Malbeke. Vos had turned to the artist and his workshop to produce something similar, on a more modest scale, yet visually compelling enough to attract him many prayers. Significantly, Vos' funerary strategy did not stop there. Not only did he have a memorial made, but he also secured an indulgence for it, to make sure that it would be duly venerated. Indulgences were remissions of a set length of time that one would otherwise have to spend expiating their sins in purgatory. In other words, they promised repentant sinners a faster ascent into heaven. Indulgences could only be issued by prelates. Bishops were allowed to grant up to 40 days, cardinals up to 100, while popes could dispense an unlimited number. Indulgences could be earned by the faithful either by praying or by paying, and they were widely used in the late Middle Ages to raise funds for the building of churches and hospitals, and also for good works such as the care of the poor and the elderly. However, it is not hard to see how a system in which salvation could essentially be purchased would lead to abuses, and the dramatic increase in indulgence peddling in the end of the 15th century was a decisive factor in sparking the Reformation. Today, a symbol of Catholic greed and corruption, indulgences have bad press, to say the least. However, what's often overlooked by critics is that most indulgences were not traded for cash, but for prayers. Small pardons of 40 days frequently rewarded things like attendance at Mass or sermon, participation in a procession, the reciting of a prayer at certain time, the singing of a hymn. Many indulgences were grounded in material culture and relied on visual, oral, or even gustatory prompts for the recitation of special prayers, usually an Ave Maria or a Pater Noster. For instance, pardons were often associated with bells. They rewarded those who would say the appropriate prayer at the bell's toll. The Guild of Corpus Christi at York owned a bowl inscribed on its rim with the promise of an indulgence to anyone who drank from it. Images, too, were widely used as support for indulgences in two distinct ways. First, pardon became associated with specific iconographic themes, such as the Virgin of the Sun, the Holy Face, the Mass of St. Gregory shown on screen, and the Man of Sorrows. These pardons extended to every object that featured this imagery and were prodigiously large, ranging in the thousands of years of remission, which contributed both to their huge popularity but also to a lot of criticism and suspicion that the promised rewards were spurious. Indulgences could also be attached to single images, for instance, a specific sculpture or panel painting at a specific site. It is just such a pardon that was attached to Jan Vos's memorial, lost diptych, and clay tablet. The indulgence issued by Bishop Martin van Bleya guaranteed 40 days of remission, the most Bleya could grant as a bishop, to whoever would greet the Virgin in the Frick panel with an Ave Maria, the first line of which, significantly, as discussed earlier, appears on the canopy behind the Virgin. This suggests that Jan Vos anticipated the granting of the indulgence by requesting Van Eyck or his assistant to inscribe this commonly indulgence prayer on the painting, thus inviting the viewer to interact with the object. The indulgence could also be gained by saluting St. Barbara or St. Elizabeth with both the Ave Maria and the Pater Noster. The same 40 days were also granted to those who would, quote, rejoice in the resurrection, unquote, by reciting the Ave Maria and Pater Noster in front of the diptych or say an Ave in front of the clay tablet. Interestingly, Jan Vos's three images were only designated by their subject matter and medium. No mention is made of their maker, and despite their distinct material and artistic worth, the Van Eyck being clearly more valuable than the clay tablet, the three objects were assigned equal spiritual value, a remission of 40 days. As a spiritual privilege granted to the Carthusians, the indulgence was only valid as long as the objects remained within the order. Thus, on the walls of the Frick collection, the Virgin has long lost its power of spiritual remission. 40 days pardons like that attached to Jan Vos's memorial were ubiquitous at the time, and they were routinely granted to stimulate veneration towards newly made images, perhaps most famously Klaus Sluter's Well of Moses at the Charterhouse of Bruges, near Dijon. At Nieuwlicht alone, the Frick Virgin was not the only indulgence image. A previously overlooked pardon of 40 days was granted in 1521 to whoever would greet with an Ave the sculpture of the Virgin Mary, Christ, and John the Baptist that adorned the church portal. 3 additional 40-day indulgences rewarded the Nieuwlicht monks for various other devotional acts. Since 40 days was rather modest and widespread reward compared to the hundreds of years of remission available at major pilgrimage sites, the Frick Virgin would hardly have attracted crowds of faithful to the Charterhouse, especially since lay access to Carthusian monasteries was restricted. Instead, the image was intended for the monks and the lay brothers themselves, and the occasional visitor. As to the original document, we know nothing of the appearance of the Indulgence Letter. It may have been a rather simple document on paper with the authenticated bishop's seal. But considering Jan Vos's taste for images, he may have ensured that the letter would be a more deluxe object, written down on parchment, and that would incorporate a painted decoration alluding to the indulgence's content, like a surviving example from the Carthusian nunnery of Bruges, the sister house to Reunited. The exact circumstances under which the indulgence was granted to the Frick Virgin have never been explored. A fresh look at the Newlicht archives reveals that the indulgence was granted at the express request of Lord Jan Vos. Jan Vos's efforts to secure an indulgence from Bishop van Bleya was facilitated by the fact that the two men certainly knew each other. Martin van Bleya spent most of his career as suffragan Bishop of Utrecht and would have had many opportunities to meet Jan Vos, then procurator of the nearby Charterhouse. Many late medieval indulgences were granted by suffragan bishops like Martin van Bleya, in many cases in exchange for a fee. Why did Jan Vos seek an indulgence for the Frick Virgin, his small diptych and clay tablet? It was relatively common practice for heads of religious institutions to petition passing bishops for this kind of privilege for their church and monasteries, as they enhanced the spiritual cachet of the establishment and sometimes attracted donations. However, in the case of the Frick Virgin, there was something more personal in Jan Vos's endeavor. The indulgence seems to have been conceived as a crucial part of Jan Vos's funerary strategy. It was a proactive way for him to call attention on his memorial and make sure that his colleagues, both present and future, would remember him in their prayers while contributing to the spiritual benefit of the Carthusian community as a whole. Thus, Jan Vos used the indulgence to boost his memory and increase suffrages for his soul among his fellow monks. Though uncommon, this strategy is not unique. A sculpted memorial tablet at Saint-Omer, belonging to the local canon Jean de Libourg, reflects a similarly proactive approach to attract prayers from viewers. Libourg did not seek or succeed in having an indulgence attached to his memorial. Instead, he opted for the epitaph to depict the Mass of St. Gregory. A prominent inscription appended to the monument advertised a prodigious indulgence of 20,000 years available to worshippers. Effectively, what the Libourg tablets made was its beholder was a mutually beneficial offer. Instead of benefiting only Libourg's souls, as most memorial did, the recitation of special prayer in front of the tablet would also improve the viewer's own prospects for salvation through the remission offered by the indulgence. In both cases, the indulgence's main goal was to draw attention to the memorial, eventually attracting prayers for the soul of the man commemorated in addition to those specified in the indulgence. This is akin to a widespread but overlooked trend of indulgences that rewarded prayers for the souls of named individuals. For instance, a pardon was granted in 1439 to whoever would recite an Ave Maria for the soul of Matilda Talbot, late prioress of the Benedictine Priory of Poleslow in the British town of Exeter. Ubiquitous in late medieval England, these indulgences were mostly 40-day grants issued by local bishop, and as in the case of Jan Vos, they were actively pursued by their recipients during their lifetime. These pardons were sometimes advertised through inscription appended on tombs and funerary monuments themselves. For instance, the brass tomb slab of William Fiennes at Hurst-Monceau informed the viewer that 120 days of remissions were available to those who would say an Ave Maria and a Pater Noster for the deceased soul. The indulgence attached to Jan Vos's memorial was certainly advertised in a similar way. It may have appeared on its lost original frame, along with another inscription identifying the deceased. Alternatively, the original letter, or more likely a copy of it, may also have been displayed next to the memorial, reminding the monks of the object's indulgent status, and further inviting them to pray in front of it. Jan Vos was undoubtedly familiar with this type of commemorative indulgences. Indeed, the Newlicht archives reveal that 2 such pardons had been bestowed upon the monastery by local prelates. The first one was granted by the Bishop of Utrecht, Frederick van Blankenheim, in 1408, and dispensed 40 days of remissions whenever in their masses the monk would commemorate him by imploring God for the salvation of his soul. This provision is unusual in that the bishop issuing the indulgence is also the one benefiting from it. But in any case, this provides a telling precedent at Neulicht for the practice of using indulgences to bolster commemoration, and they afford an illuminating context for the understanding of Jan Vos's strategy for eternity. Where Jan Vos differed from that's the indulgence from Bishop Blankenheim. Where Jan Vos differed from Bishop Blankenheim is that he did not seek to attach an indulgence directly to prayers for his soul, but to the object conceived to perpetuate his memoria, the Frick Virgin. In procuring the indulgence, Jan Vos transformed the panel into a currency in the economy of salvation that pervaded the era, an object that could effectively heal one's soul, both his and the viewer's. The Frick and Exeter Virgins survived the destruction of the two charter houses that Jan Vos led during his career. While his body lies anonymously somewhere under the residential buildings that now stand on the site of Neulicht's former cemetery, his memorial proudly hangs on the walls of the Frick collection. Venerated today for its artistic qualities rather than as an object that could impart spiritual healing, Jan Vos's memorial has fulfilled its function, though perhaps not in the ways that he had anticipated. It had kept alive the memory of this artistically savvy Carthusian monk whose patronage of Jan van Eyck and Petrus Christus gave us two masterworks of early Netherlandish painting. And I would like to end by going back to Patrick Lee Fermer's experience at Fontenelle Abbey, with which I opened this lecture. After a few days of adjustment, the writer realized that monastic restraint afforded him a new state of mental clarity, feeling, quote, full of energy and limpid freshness, unquote. Fermer shared his enthusiasm with the abbot about what a blessed relief it was to refrain from talking all day long. The abbot replied, yes, in the outside world, speech is gravely abused. Following this wise observation, I shall stop speaking now and let the images draw you in. Thank you very much.